Aachen sector, on the western border of Germany, October 1944. Inside a concrete pillbox on a low rise of farmland, a German machine gunner belonging to a hastily assembled fortress battalion has done everything his training promised would keep him alive. He is behind a wall of reinforced concrete roughly 5 feet thick. His weapon points out through a narrow embrasure barely wider than a letter slot, angled so that it covers the open ground in front of the pillbox beside his, which in turn covers the ground in front of his. He has grenades stacked within reach, a spare barrel for the gun, and enough ammunition to hold this ground for a full day of fighting. Above his head sits a roof of concrete and steel that the German engineers who poured it had calculated could shrug off a direct hit from field artillery. He has been told, by his officers, and by 4 years of relentless state propaganda, that he is sitting inside the strongest fixed defensive line in the world. Nothing a foot soldier carries can reach him in here. Nothing a tank can do at these ranges will crack this box open. He has been shelled for 2 days already, and he is still breathing, which to him is proof that the concrete is keeping its promise. And then the promise breaks in a way that no one prepared him for. There is no massed infantry charge across the open ground in front of his firing slot, the kind of attack his interlocking fields of fire were designed to slaughter. There is no tank grinding up the road to trade shots he knows his position can survive. Instead, there is a small team of American infantry working quietly along the blind side of his pillbox, the one angle his embrasure cannot cover, and one of them is carrying something heavy and awkward on his back. A moment later, a rod of liquid fire crosses the last few yards of ground and splashes against the concrete beside the embrasure, and burning fuel sprays through the slot into the sealed room. The temperature spikes. The air itself seems to ignite, and the man who was told he was untouchable behind 5 feet of concrete does the one thing his entire fortified line was built to prevent him from doing. He lets go of his weapon, and he crawls out of the low rear entrance with his hands raised, surrendering to a squad he could have held off for hours, because the sanctuary has become an oven, and every instinct in his body is screaming at him to get out before the next burst comes. His counterparts, captured up and down this line in the autumn and winter of 1944, tell a version of the same story to American interrogators again and again. The pillbox was supposed to protect them. Instead, it had trapped them. One captured German, quoted in a British account of the same border fighting, put the feeling into words that traveled through Allied units like a rumor of something almost unfair. His comrades, he said, were afraid of the flamethrowers, and would not let themselves be caught inside a pillbox once the flame weapons were brought forward. It is a strange thing for a soldier to admit. He is not saying the Americans had more men, though at times they did. He is not saying they had heavier guns, though at times they had those too. He is saying that the very thing built to make him feel safe had been turned into the thing most likely to kill him, and that once that inversion happened, the concrete simply stopped mattering. Here is the puzzle that sits underneath this whole story, and it is a stranger puzzle than the popular version suggests. The Westwall, the belt of fortifications the Allies called the Siegfried Line, was real. It was enormous. It ran for more than 390 miles along Germany's western frontier, from the town of Cleve near the Dutch border in the north, down to Weil am Rhein on the Swiss border in the south. And it contained, by the most commonly cited figure, more than 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, command posts, and troop shelters, laced together with belts of dragon's teeth and anti-tank ditches. Men fought and bled and died in front of it for months on end. And yet, again and again, individual positions that should have cost an attacker dearly were given up by their garrisons soon after a single team of engineers and infantry got close enough to bring fire to bear. So the real question is not simply why flame worked. The real question is why fire, of all things, broke the will of men who would otherwise stand and take artillery, who would stand and take rifle and machine gun fire, who would crouch behind concrete and trade casualties with the best infantry the American army could send at them. Why did the flame weapon, which was in cold mechanical terms one of the least reliable and shortest range tools in the entire American inventory, do what tons of high explosives so often could not? The answer has almost nothing to do with the flamethrower being a superior weapon. In nearly every measurable way, it was not. The answer has to do with what a fortification actually is, underneath the concrete and the steel, and the fields of fire. A pillbox is not really a machine for stopping bullets. A pillbox is a machine for managing fear. And fire is the one thing that reaches past the concrete and attacks the fear directly, without having to defeat the wall at all. To understand why the Westwall's defenders broke, you have to stop looking at the flamethrower as a weapon and start looking at it as a key, cut precisely to fit a lock that the Germans themselves had built into their own fortifications, without ever realizing that the keyhole was there. Let us take the Westwall seriously first, because it is the easiest part of this story to underestimate, and because the men who surrendered inside it were not cowards huddled in flimsy shelters. The line was begun in the middle of the 1930s and built in earnest from 1938 into 1940, a colossal national undertaking overseen by Fritz Todt, the engineer whose construction organization would become one of the great forced labor machines of the German war economy. At the height of the work in 1938, more than 500,000 men were laboring on the fortifications at once. By one careful accounting, drawn from the American Army's own official history, roughly a third of Germany's entire annual production of cement was being poured into the Western defenses in that period. The scale was so vast that, on paper, the whole project was planned around an average density of about one fortified work for every 28 yards of front. This was not a thin crust to be punched through in an afternoon. It was meant to be a deep zone of defense, in places up to 20 miles deep, an entire landscape re-engineered so that an attacker who broke through one belt of pillboxes would look up and find himself in front of another. The line was not thrown up all at once, but built in overlapping phases as the political situation grew tenser across the late 1930s. The earliest work produced relatively modest border guard posts, with walls only around 20 inches thick, meant more to hold a watch on the frontier than to survive a serious battle. As the risk of war climbed, later programs called for far heavier construction, thicker walls, deeper works, and a much greater density of positions, culminating in the frantic push of 1938 to fortify the whole western border before any fighting could begin. The propaganda that surrounded all of this labor was as important to the German state as the concrete itself. Newsreels showed endless columns of workers and mountains of cement, and the message to the German people, and to the watching French across the border, was that the Reich had sealed its western door with something no army on earth could force. The wall was, from the very beginning, meant to be seen and believed in as much as it was meant to be fought from. The individual structures were built to a system the Germans called Regelbau, which means standard construction, a catalogue of numbered designs that could be reproduced up and down the line by different work crews and still come out consistent. The most common single type was a compact bunker with walls and a roof around 5 feet thick, holding a crew of roughly 10 to a dozen men in a central room fitted with gas-tight doors, with a raised fighting compartment where a machine gun fired out through a steel-lined embrasure. Thousands of that one type alone were built, so many that a soldier moving along the line would see the same familiar layout again and again, the same entrance, the same firing room, the same cramped bunk space, repeated for hundreds of miles. At the heavier end of the catalogue stood true underground works with multiple stories, dozens of rooms, armoured machine gun turrets weighing many tons apiece, and enough stored food, water and ammunition to keep a garrison of 80 or 90 men fighting and living underground for weeks, without any resupply from outside. A few of these great works even mounted a fixed flamethrower of their own, a fortress flame weapon fed from a large reservoir of oil, built into the structure to scour attackers off the roof and away from the entrances. The Germans, in other words, understood perfectly well what flame could do to men in an enclosed fight. They had simply designed it as a weapon to protect their bunkers, and never imagined it turned the other way, poured in through their own firing slots from the outside. In front of the pillboxes ran the dragon's teeth, rows of pyramid-shaped concrete blocks 3 to 4 feet tall, set into continuous concrete foundations, sunk deep into the earth, so that tanks could not simply shove them aside or dig in underneath them. The rows were staggered and stepped, rising toward the rear so that a tank trying to climb them would expose its thin belly armor to the anti-tank guns waiting behind. In many sectors, the teeth were paired with a wide, deep anti-tank ditch, and with belts of mines and coils of barbed wire strung between the obstacles, the whole arrangement designed not so much to stop an attacker outright as to hold him in the open, channel him, and slow him down inside ground that the machine guns and the artillery had already measured to the yard. And behind all of it, in their concrete boxes, the machine gunners waited. And this is the crucial design idea, the one that will matter more and more as this story goes on. The individual pillbox was never meant to win a battle all by itself. It was meant to make the men inside it feel survivable enough to hold their ground while they did their real job, which was to channel the attacker into ground already surveyed and registered by German mortars and heavier artillery further back, and to buy time for a counterattack to be organized. The whole architecture was a psychological instrument, at least as much as a military one. It said to the man inside, "Stay, hold, do not run, because in here you will live, and out there you will die." As long as the concrete kept that promise, the defender did his job, and the machine worked. The fortification's real function was to control the fear of the man it contained. There was, however, an enormous gap between the myth of the Westwall and its actual physical condition by the time the Americans reached it in September 1944, and this gap matters greatly for everything that followed. After France fell in 1940, the line had been essentially abandoned as a live defensive position for 4 years. The war had rolled hundreds of miles to the west, and the fortifications sat quietly in the German rear, slowly rotting. Weapons were stripped out of the bunkers and shipped to the Atlantic coast to arm Hitler's new wall against an invasion from Britain. Armored doors, ventilation equipment, periscopes, and machine gun mounts were pulled out and carted away. Buried telephone cables corroded in the damp ground. Rooms filled with standing water. The minefields and the belts of wire that had once covered the ground in front of the pillboxes were lifted and never replaced. By the time the Allied armies came racing up out of France in the late summer of 1944, the great impregnable rampart of the propaganda posters was, across long stretches of its length, a chain of empty, stripped, waterlogged concrete boxes with no guns in them and no trained soldiers to fire the guns that were no longer there. When Hitler ordered the line reactivated in the last week of August 1944, the German army had to perform something close to a resurrection, and to do it under brutal time pressure. Tens of thousands of laborers, including boys pulled out of the compulsory National Labor Service, some of them only 14 and 16 years old, were thrown at the fortifications to make them fightable again. But you cannot conjure trained fortress crews out of the air in a few weeks. The men who filled the pillboxes that autumn were a patchwork. Some came from the newly raised divisions given the name Volksgrenadier, a word deliberately chosen to weld together the German word for the common people with the proud old word for infantry, formations that contained plenty of brave and capable soldiers, but also a great many hastily trained conscripts. Others were fortress battalions and second-line units, men who were older, or younger, or still recovering from earlier wounds, or simply swept up in the emergency to plug a gap in the line. Threaded among all of them were hard veterans and fanatical officers who would fight to the death and who would shoot any man who tried to leave his post. It was, in short, an uneven garrison holding a formidable but badly neglected line, and the unevenness of its morale would turn out to be the exact surface on which a terror weapon could do its work. Now bring in the weapon itself, and here we have to be honest in a way that most popular accounts of this fighting simply are not, because the truth is a great deal more interesting than the myth. The image most people carry in their heads is of a lone American infantryman with a flamethrower on his back, walking up to bunker after bunker and burning the German army out of the Siegfried Line all by himself. That image is largely wrong, and taking it apart carefully is the key to understanding what actually happened along that border. The standard American portable flamethrower of this period was a backpack device, weighing around 70 pounds when it was filled, carrying roughly 4 to 5 gallons of fuel, with an effective reach of only about 20 to 50 yards, depending on the model and the type of fuel it was throwing. The early model, standardized back in 1942, had an ignition system that was notoriously unreliable, prone to failing in damp and cold conditions, which is to say, prone to failing in precisely the wet, freezing weather of a German autumn and winter. The improved models that came later fired a thickened fuel, an early form of napalm, which left the nozzle as a coherent burning rod rather than a loose spray. This was a real advance, and it is worth understanding why. Thin liquid fuel came out of the early weapons as a wide, ragged spray that burned up quickly in the air, wasted much of itself before it arrived, and fell far short of the target. Thickened fuel behaved almost like a stream of burning jelly. It held together in flight, so that far more of the charge actually reached the enemy position instead of burning off harmlessly on the way. It could be bounced off a wall and around a corner. It carried noticeably farther, and it clung and kept burning on whatever it struck. A jet of thickened fuel could put a large share of its charge right through an embrasure at ranges where the older thin-fueled weapon would have delivered almost nothing. It was still short-ranged by the standards of any other weapon on the field, but against the specific problem of a firing slot in a concrete wall, the thickened fuel turned a clumsy device into something genuinely dangerous. But even at its best, the portable flamethrower was heavy, short-ranged, and dangerous to its own operator, a man who had to walk upright and slow toward an enemy position while carrying a conspicuous pair of tanks on his back, which made him the single most obvious and most tempting target on the whole battlefield. Worse, from the American point of view, the portable flamethrower had a thin and troubled combat record in Europe specifically. It was overwhelmingly a weapon of the Pacific War, where it earned its fearsome reputation burning Japanese defenders out of caves and log bunkers on one island after another. In the European theatre, the story was very different. Crews were frequently poorly trained on the device. Many of the flamethrowers issued for the invasion of France were lost or thrown away in the chaos of the beaches and the brutal hedgerow fighting that followed, and there is essentially no record of the weapon being used at all during the Normandy landings themselves. American infantry divisions, even veteran ones, tended to regard the flamethrower as an unfamiliar and troublesome piece of equipment rather than a trusted and understood tool. So we have a paradox nested inside our larger paradox. The weapon supposedly responsible for cracking the entire Siegfried line was, in American hands in Europe, comparatively rare, frequently unreliable, dangerously short-ranged, and quietly distrusted by many of the men who were expected to carry it into battle. To keep this account honest, we have to give a great deal of the credit where it truly belongs, which is to the British. The most dramatic and the most consistently effective use of flame against Westwall pillboxes in this fighting came not from American backpacks at all, but from British flame-throwing tanks, the Churchill Crocodile. The Crocodile was a heavy Churchill tank towing an armoured trailer full of flame fuel, able to hurl a jet of fire far beyond the reach of any man-portable weapon, well over 100 yards, and to do it from behind thick armour plate that rifle fire and machine guns could not touch. When British crocodiles came forward to support American infantry around the Geilenkirchen salient in November 1944, in an operation to reduce a particularly stubborn stretch of the line, the effect on German morale was immediate, and it is from that fighting that some of the most vivid surviving testimony comes. An American officer who watched it happen described how a few squirts of flame from the tanks brought the Germans pouring out of their positions, and concluded, flatly, that the enemy were terrified of the flamethrowers and would not stay inside a pillbox once the flame came near them. That very quote, so often recycled to illustrate the American backpack flamethrower, actually describes British armour doing the work. The distinction genuinely matters, because it tells us that the decisive variable in all of this was never the specific piece of hardware, it was the fire itself. So if the portable flamethrower was unreliable and rare, and if much of the real flame work along this border was actually done by British tanks, then why does the flame weapon sit at the very center of this story at all? Why did fire, delivered by whatever means happened to be available, so reliably do what other and heavier weapons could not? To answer that, we have to look closely at what actually happened, both physically and psychologically, when flame reached a sealed concrete room. And then we have to look at the wider American way of fighting that surrounded the flame and made it lethal, because the flame never worked alone. Start with the physics, because it is genuinely different from what a bullet or a shell does. A rifle round travels in a straight line and stops dead at the first solid thing it strikes. A shell delivers a violent but momentary blast at its single point of impact. Concrete is superbly good at defeating both of those threats. 5 feet of reinforced concrete will stop rifle and machine gun fire completely, and it will shrug off all but the very heaviest artillery, and even heavy artillery usually needed several direct hits on the same exact spot to breach a well-built bunker. But fire does not behave like a bullet, and it does not behave like a shell. Burning liquid flows. It runs along surfaces, it pools in low places, it splashes around corners, and above all it pours in through openings. And a pillbox, by its very nature, must have openings. It has an embrasure for its weapon to fire out through. It has a doorway for the crew to enter and leave. It has ventilation slots so the men inside can breathe, and so the choking fumes of their own weapon can escape. Every single one of those openings, each one designed to let the pillbox do its job, is also a channel through which fire can enter. The concrete that so easily defeats the bullet is nearly helpless against the thing that simply flows around it and pours in through the very holes the defenders cannot seal without blinding and suffocating themselves. Once fire enters a sealed concrete room, it does several terrible things all at once, and every one of them is catastrophic for the men trapped inside. It burns, of course, and thickened fuel that clings to skin and clothing burns in a way almost too dreadful to describe. But it also greedily consumes the oxygen in the enclosed space, so that even men who are not directly touched by the flame suddenly find themselves gasping in air that will no longer keep them conscious. It fills the room with thick black smoke and with carbon monoxide, the poisonous gas that combustion produces, so that men are blinded and poisoned at the very same moment. And it drives the temperature upward with terrifying speed, inside a space that has nowhere for the heat to go. The concrete room, the very feature that had made the position feel so strong, now works savagely against its own occupants, holding the heat and the smoke and the poisoned air pressed in against them with no escape. The fortification's single greatest strength, its solidity and its total enclosure, becomes in an instant the greatest danger its occupants face. But here is the part that matters most of all, the part that truly explains the surrenders, and it is not really about the physics at all. In the overwhelming majority of documented cases, the German crews did not stay put and wait to be burned alive. They surrendered at the mere threat of fire, at the first squirt of flame against the concrete outside, and sometimes at nothing more than the sight of a flame weapon being carried forward toward them. The fire very often did not need to fill the room at all. It only needed to demonstrate, convincingly, that it could. One American account of reducing a cluster of 3 linked pillboxes describes German soldiers who had already been driven from room to room by rocket fire and hand grenades, and who still stubbornly refused to give up, right up until one short burst from a flamethrower abruptly changed their minds. The flame in that instance did not kill them. It persuaded them. It communicated to them, in a language older and deeper than any army's, a specific and unbearable promise about exactly how they would die if they chose to stay. And that wordless promise accomplished what tons of high explosive had not. It broke the psychological contract that the pillbox had made with them. The concrete had said, "Stay here and you will live." The fire said, "Stay here and you will burn alive." And no soldier's discipline, however good, is built to win that particular argument. This is the reason fire could break men who would otherwise stand and absorb almost any other kind of punishment. A soldier under an artillery bombardment can still believe his way through it. He believes the concrete overhead will protect him, and very often it does. He believes that if he keeps his head down and waits, the barrage will lift, and that he survives simply by staying still and staying low. Fire annihilates every one of those beliefs at the same instant. There is no keeping your head down against something that flows downward and fills the room from the floor up. There is no waiting it out. There is no protective value left in the thick walls, because the walls are now the very thing sealing the fire and the smoke and the heat in against your body. And a fortress whose defenders have stopped believing in it is no longer a fortress at all. It is only a set of very expensive concrete rooms, full of frightened men looking urgently for a way out. It is worth staying for a moment with the men on the receiving end of all this, because their state of mind is the whole hinge of the story, and it was more fragile than the concrete around them suggested. When American intelligence officers questioned the prisoners taken along this border through the autumn of 1944, a picture emerged that had little in common with the fanatical last-ditch defender of legend. Many of the captured men were bitter and exhausted. Some complained that their officers had abandoned them or had fled to safety and left the ordinary soldiers to hold the concrete. A great many had already privately concluded that the war was lost, that no secret weapon was coming to save them, and that they were being asked to die for a line that everyone above them knew could not hold. They respected certain things about their enemy with a professional's clarity. They feared Allied artillery, and they feared the fighter bombers that hunted anything that moved in daylight. And they feared, above almost everything, the flame. These were not men looking for a reason to die in place. Many of them were looking, quietly and shamefully and desperately, for a reason they could live with to stop, and the arrival of fire against their position gave them exactly that. A man could tell himself, and tell his comrades, and tell his captors, that no one could have been expected to stay inside a burning box. The flame did not only defeat the defender's body, it gave his conscience permission to quit. That is not the whole picture, and honesty demands the other half of it. Plenty of German soldiers on this line did not surrender at all. They fought, and they counterattacked, and they died in their concrete, and some of them did so under the shadow of threats that had nothing to do with courage. As the line began to crack, senior German commanders issued furious orders against any thought of surrender, and in some sectors named men accused of desertion and warned openly that the families of those who gave up would answer for it. Fear of the enemy's fire and fear of one's own side pulled at the same frightened men from opposite directions. Where the veterans and the committed officers held a position together, it often held to the last. Where the garrison was tired, or young, or second-rate, or simply left alone with its own judgment when the flame arrived, it broke. The Westwall did not fail everywhere at once. It failed unevenly, garrison by garrison, exactly along the seams of its defenders' morale, and fire was the tool that found those seams faster than anything else. Now we come to the part of the story that the popular image gets most badly wrong, and correcting it is what separates an honest account from a comfortable myth. The flamethrower, whether carried on a man's back or mounted in a tank, almost never worked alone. A lone operator walking up to a defended pillbox all by himself would have been shot down long before he ever got within his weapon's pathetically short range. Flame was only ever one instrument in a carefully arranged combined arms performance, and understanding that arrangement is the same thing as understanding how the Westwall was actually broken. The American method for reducing a fortified position, worked out and steadily refined in the hard fighting along the German border through the autumn of 1944, went roughly like this. It began not with flame at all, but with fire of an entirely different kind. Artillery, mortars, and the direct fire of tanks and assault guns were brought down onto and around the target. The purpose of this opening bombardment was rarely to destroy the pillbox itself, because commanders learned very quickly that ordinary field artillery usually could not penetrate the thick concrete. The purpose was to drive the defenders inside. A pillbox crew did not spend a battle sealed up inside their concrete box like passengers. They fought from trenches and foxholes dug in and around the position, using the bunker itself as a strong shelter to fall back into when the pressure grew too great. The opening bombardment was designed to force those men out of their open fighting positions and back inside the concrete, and then to keep their heads pinned down while something else moved. That something else was the assault team, closing in, while machine gun fire and direct tank fire hammered relentlessly against the embrasure, blinding the pillbox by turning its own firing slot into a lethal place to even look out from. A small team of infantry and combat engineers worked its way carefully around to the flank and the rear, into the blind angles that the fixed embrasure could not cover. These were the men who carried the tools that actually did the work. They had pole charges, which were large demolition charges lashed to the end of a length of timber, to be shoved hard against a door or an embrasure and then detonated. They had satchel charges packed with explosive. They had Bangalore torpedoes for blowing gaps through wire, and they had bazookas, and they had white phosphorus grenades, whose blinding smoke and clinging burning particles were themselves a small and vicious cousin of the flamethrowers' terror. And sometimes, among all these tools, they had flame. The flame's role in this careful sequence was usually not to demolish the structure. It was to persuade the garrison to give up, or to suppress the men inside during the final seconds while the demolition team placed the heavy charge that would destroy the pillbox for good, so that it could never be manned and reoccupied. None of this came naturally to green troops, and the Americans knew it. This kind of fighting had to be learned, and it was learned the hard way, in blood, and then taught deliberately to the men who came after. When units rotated back out of the line to rest, their commanders put them through short, intense courses on reducing fortifications, building crude dummy pillboxes out of earth and timber, and sending the men against them over and over with demolition charges, bazookas, and flame, until the drill became something like second nature. The sequence was rehearsed as a piece of teamwork, every man knowing his job. One group laid down the covering fire on the embrasure, another moved the pole charge or the flame to the blind side, another carried the heavy demolition charge that would finish the position. Officers wrote up what worked and what did not, and passed it up the chain, and the lessons were gathered into after-action reports and training notes that spread the hard-won knowledge across the army. What had begun in September as improvisation, small units figuring out on their own how to crack a bunker without being slaughtered, had hardened by the winter into a recognized method, a battle drill for reducing a fortified line. The Americans, in effect, were writing the manual in the field, one pillbox at a time. And it is worth pausing on the sheer courage this method demanded of the men at its sharp end, because the account should never let the neatness of the drill hide the horror of carrying it out. To reach the blind side of a pillbox, a soldier had to cross open, swept ground, often uphill, often through wire and mines, while the neighboring pillboxes, each one sited specifically to cover its neighbors, poured fire across his path. Men were hit going in. The soldier carrying the pole charge or the flamethrower knew that he was the target every German gunner wanted most, and he went forward anyway, because that was the job. In the fighting north of Aachen, a young private, moving with his squad against the pillbox line, threw himself onto a German grenade to save the men around him, and was killed doing it, and was later awarded his country's highest decoration for it. That single act stands in for countless smaller ones that were never written down. Behind every clean sentence about a garrison that surrendered to the threat of flame, there were American soldiers who had crossed ground that should have killed them to make that threat real. There is a detail from this fighting that captures the whole underlying dynamic better than any statistic could, and it concerns not flamethrowers at all, but armored bulldozers. American engineers discovered that one of the most effective ways to deal with a stubborn, occupied pillbox was to bring up an armored bulldozer and simply push earth against the embrasure and up over the doorway, sealing the defenders alive inside a concrete tomb of their own making. And the accounts note again and again that the German crews very often did not wait for that burial to be finished. As the dirt began to pile up against their only openings, blocking out their light and cutting off their air, they came scrambling out with their hands raised before the final shovelful could drop. It is exactly the same psychology as the flame, arriving by a completely different road. The moment the fortification stopped being a shelter and revealed itself to be a prison, the will to hold it collapsed. Fire and burial were simply two ways of proving the same thing to the men inside, that the concrete they trusted had turned against them. Before we follow one division into that method at full scale, Honesty requires noting how much of the line was never stormed at all. When the first American spearheads reached the Westwall in the second week of September 1944, they found long stretches of it undefended, the concrete boxes empty, the guns long gone, no soldiers manning the positions the propaganda had made so fearsome. In some places, American tanks and armored infantry simply drove clean through the belt before the Germans could rush troops forward to hold it, and had to be pushed back only by hasty counterattacks. Elsewhere, commanders looked at a strong section of the line, chose not to pay the price of a frontal fight, and went around it instead, leaving the garrison to wither. The Westwall was never a single unbroken barrier that had to be smashed head-on along its whole length. It was a chain, and a chain can be slipped as well as broken. The pillbox assaults, the flame and the charges and the dying in front of the embrasures happened where the Germans managed to man the line in strength, and where the Americans chose, for reasons of ground or speed, to go straight through rather than around. The dramatic fight was real, but it was never the only way the wall was beaten, and any account that forgets the empty bunkers of that first September week has already started to drift toward the myth. To see how all of this played out at full scale, look at the fighting along the Würm River, north of Aachen, in the first week of October 1944, where the American 30th Infantry Division set out to break clean through the Siegfried Line. The division's commander, Major General Leland Hobbs, chose a single narrow sector, little more than a mile wide, and concentrated everything he had upon it. Before the infantry moved a step, the position was pounded from the air by more than 300 medium bombers and dozens of fighter bombers, and hammered by massed artillery, including heavy self-propelled guns, brought up to fire directly at the pillboxes over open sights. And here the honest, unglamorous lesson of the entire campaign appears in its starkest form. The aerial bombing and the shelling, for all their noise and fury, barely scratched the concrete. The aircraft bombs scored almost no direct hits on the pillboxes at all. Only the heaviest guns, the big self-propelled pieces firing directly at close range, could actually penetrate a bunker, and even they generally needed several hits on the same structure to do the job. The lesson the Americans drew from this was not that firepower alone could ever smash the line open. The lesson was that firepower could pin and blind and isolate the defenders for just long enough to let the assault teams cross the deadly ground and finish the work at arm's length. And finish it they did. The infantry crossed the little Würm River on footbridges, thrown across it by engineers working under fire, fought their way forward to the pillboxes, and reduced them one after another with demolition charges and flame and raw nerve, taking a heavy toll of casualties as they went. In a single day, one regiment, the 117th Infantry, reduced 11 pillboxes at a cost of 227 men, and it did so fighting without any armor support at all, because the tanks could not yet get across the river. Over the course of the whole operation, the division cracked its way through the fortified belt, reducing dozens of pillboxes in the process, and Hobbs was soon able to report to his superiors that they had a hole in the thing big enough to drive 2 divisions through, and that he had no doubt the line was cracked wide open. It was a genuine and important achievement, and it was extremely expensive in lives, and there was nothing whatsoever magical about it. It was method. It was raw courage. It was heavy guns firing directly over open sights, and engineers with explosives crawling to the blind side, and, woven through the whole assault, the terror of fire persuading one garrison after another that the moment to quit had finally arrived. The fighting inside the city of Aachen itself, during those very same weeks, showed the same tools turned to the dense and murderous problem of urban combat. Aachen was the first major German city the Allies assaulted, a place of deep symbolic weight as the ancient coronation city of Charlemagne, and it had been folded directly into the fortified line, its solid buildings and deep cellars and public air raid shelters converted into a web of strongpoints. 2 battalions of American infantry ground their way through it street by street, backed by tanks, by tank destroyers, and by a self-propelled 155mm gun, an enormous weapon that they used to knock down strongpoints at point-blank range, one building at a time. flame had its place here too. Two-man flamethrower teams were attached to the assault companies, and they were used to help clear the deep cellars and shelters where soldiers and terrified civilians were packed in together. But once again, the flame was only one tool among many. The battle was won by the systematic, patient application of overwhelming direct firepower against one position at a time, with fire and demolition and the sheer crushing psychological weight of a 155mm shell arriving straight through a wall, doing most of the persuading. When the German commander of the city, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, finally surrendered his garrison on October 21, 1944, it was only after a heavy gun had been firing shell after shell into his final command bunker from a range of barely 200 yards. The city fell in ruins, with something on the order of 85% of it destroyed or badly damaged, and the fighting cost both sides many thousands of casualties. Not far to the south, in the dark and dripping Hurtgen forest, that very same period produced the grim mirror image of these hard-won successes, and it belongs in any honest account precisely because it shows what happened when the American combined arms method could not be brought to bear at all. In the dense, steep, waterlogged forest, the Americans could not use any of their great advantages. Artillery shells burst uselessly high in the treetops, showering splinters but leaving the deep bunkers untouched. Tanks could not move off the few narrow forest tracks, which were themselves mined and covered by fire. The assault teams that broke pillboxes so efficiently out in the open farmland now found themselves fighting half-blind among the tree trunks, stumbling onto concrete positions they could not even see until they were right on top of them, all while German defenders counterattacked them without pause. The result was one of the longest and costliest battles the American army fought anywhere in the West during the entire war, a grinding, months-long struggle that consumed roughly 33,000 American casualties, some 9,000 of them not from enemy weapons at all, but from exposure, trench foot, sickness, and accident in the freezing wet woods. Villages inside the forest changed hands over and over again. The Hurtgen stands as the proof, written in blood across a whole autumn and winter, that it was never the flamethrower alone, nor any other single weapon, that broke the Westwall. It was a whole integrated system of fighting, and in the one place where the terrain took that system apart, the line held, and the killing simply went on and on. There is one more piece of this story, and it arrived in the very last winter of the war, and it deepens the central theme rather than merely repeating it. Through most of the war, the American army had been quietly sitting on a secret artillery technology that it was forbidden to use over land, a proximity fuse that contained a tiny radio transmitter built right into the nose of the shell. The little device broadcast a signal continuously as the shell flew, and it detonated the round automatically the instant the reflected signal told it that it had reached the ideal height above the ground, producing an airburst that rained jagged fragments down over everything below it. The fuse had been guarded with extraordinary secrecy and reserved almost entirely for anti-aircraft use, out of a very real fear that a single unexploded round might fall into enemy hands and be taken apart and copied. Its use over enemy-held ground had been forbidden for years for that reason. But in December 1944, with the great German offensive in the Ardennes underway and the war clearly grinding into its final phase, that long-standing restriction was at last lifted, and the new fuses began arriving at the American gun lines in enormous quantities. This mattered intensely to the men in the pillboxes and the foxholes, for a reason that connects directly to everything else in this story. For 30 years, ever since the previous World War, an infantryman's most basic protection against artillery had rested on a single simple fact of geometry. A shell that buries its nose in the ground before it explodes throws most of its fragments outward and upward, so a man lying flat, or crouched deep in a hole, or sheltered behind a lip of concrete, was very often missed entirely by the blast passing above him. The proximity fuse erased that protection at a single stroke. Now the shell burst in the air overhead, and it flung its fragments downward, into the open hole, onto the man lying flat on his belly, onto exactly the postures and positions that had kept soldiers alive for a full generation of warfare. Against troops caught in the open, the effect was devastating, and it is remembered as one of the great technological shocks of the final campaigns of the war. Its relevance to our story is thematic, and it is precise. Like the flame that poured in through the embrasure, and like the earth pushed up over the doorway by the bulldozer, the airburst fuse attacked the defender from the one single direction his shelter did not, and could not, cover. All three of these things, in their three very different ways, were answers to the exact same problem. How do you reach a man who has carefully arranged concrete and earth between his body and the enemy? The flame flowed in through the holes. The bulldozer sealed the holes shut. The airburst came straight down from above the holes. Each one of them found the same gap in the fortress, the gap that the fortress, by its very nature, could never quite close. Step back now, and the real shape of the answer finally comes into view, and it is not at all the shape that the popular story gives it. The German soldier in the pillbox was not beaten because the Americans possessed some wonder weapon. In cold, honest terms, the portable flamethrower was among the least impressive tools on the entire battlefield. Unreliable, dangerously short-ranged, a hazard to the man carrying it, and used comparatively little in Europe at all. He was beaten because the Americans understood, in hard practice, even where they never wrote it down as theory, what a fortification truly is underneath the concrete. A pillbox is a promise made to the man inside it. The promise is that the concrete will keep faith with him, that if he stays and does his duty, the walls will preserve his life. Every fixed defense in the whole of human history has run on some version of that same promise, because a fortress full of men who no longer believe in it is completely worthless. The German engineers had built their version of the promise beautifully, in 5 feet of reinforced concrete, in interlocking fields of fire, in roofs that could genuinely take an artillery shell. What they had not reckoned with, and what they had no answer for, was an enemy who arrived with a way of fighting designed, at its very heart, to break the promise rather than to break the concrete. And breaking the promise, it turned out, was very much cheaper than breaking the concrete. You did not actually have to demolish a pillbox in order to defeat it. You only had to convince the men inside it that its protection had already failed, and fire convinced them of that faster and more completely than anything else in the whole arsenal, because fire spoke straight to the oldest and deepest fear that a human body carries within it. The full American combined arms assault, the artillery brought down to drive the crew inside, the direct fire brought up to blind the embrasure, the small team working patiently around to the blind side, the pole charges and the satchel charges, the armored bulldozer, and the flame, was in the end nothing more or less than a machine for delivering that single, simple message to one garrison after another, all along the line. Your shelter has become your trap. And the very instant a garrison came to believe that message, the fight for that particular pillbox was already over and decided, whether or not a single German inside it had yet been touched by a flame or a fragment. This is precisely why the interrogation reports from that autumn and winter read the way they do, with the same strange note of bewilderment recurring across units that had never once spoken to each other. The men had done exactly what they were trained to do. They had held their concrete, and they had been defeated all the same, not by a thicker wall or a heavier gun on the enemy's side, but by an enemy who had simply refused to fight the battle that the fortress was designed to win, and who had chosen instead to attack the one thing that the fortress was actually made of, which was never really the concrete at all, but the confidence of the men sealed up inside it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, inspecting Germany's western coastal defenses earlier that same year, had been deeply skeptical of exactly this kind of faith in concrete. He regarded the grander propaganda claims about the Atlantic Wall as something close to a bluff, a show built as much to reassure the German people as to stop an enemy, and he insisted that fixed defenses were worth little unless the men in them were backed by mobile reserves and a plan to destroy the attacker before he ever closed in. Concrete alone, in his view, gave a false sense of security. He had been talking about the coast rather than the Siegfried Line, but the warning applied just as well to the men in the pillboxes, who had been taught to trust the walls around them as if the walls could do the fighting for them. The deeper reason the Germans could never answer this, and it is worth stating plainly because it reaches far beyond this one campaign on one border, lies in the difference between building a wall and building a system. The Westwall was a magnificent wall. It was a vast, static thing, poured into the earth across the 1930s to fight a very particular kind of war, a war of fixed, continuous lines and frontal assaults, and clearly visible enemies advancing across open ground into pre-registered fields of fire. Against that specific war, it might genuinely have worked as intended. But the Americans, when they came, did not bring that war with them. They brought a flexible, combined, endlessly improvised way of fighting that treated each individual pillbox not as a wall to be stormed head-on, but as a problem to be solved, from whatever angle the concrete happened to leave open, with whatever particular combination of tools the moment happened to demand. A wall, however thick you pour it, has only a fixed set of answers built into it on the day the concrete finally cures. A system can invent a brand new answer for every single position it meets. And when a flexible system comes up against a fixed wall, the wall can only ever win the specific arguments it was designed in advance to win, while the system simply keeps on asking new questions that the wall was never built to answer at all. The German who crawled out of his pillbox near Aachen, with his hands held high in the air, had not failed as a soldier. His concrete had not failed as concrete. It had stopped the bullets it was built to stop, and it had turned aside the shells it was built to turn. What had failed was the idea underneath the concrete, the old and comforting idea that safety itself could be poured into a fixed shape, and that a man could climb inside that shape and hide there from the whole gathering violence of a modern battlefield. The fire that came pouring in through his embrasure was not really the thing that defeated him. The fire was only the messenger. The message that it carried was that the age of the wall was ending, and that no thickness of concrete could any longer protect a man from an enemy who had stopped trying to knock his wall down, and had started, instead, to reach around it, and over it, and in through the very holes that the wall could never close, until the safest-looking place on the whole battlefield had quietly, and without warning, become the single most dangerous place that a frightened soldier could possibly choose to be. If this account of how the Siegfried Line was truly broken gave you something to think about, something a little different from the familiar story of a single wonder weapon and a burning bunker, then consider subscribing. It honestly helps this kind of careful, source-driven history reach more of the people who care about getting the past right, and there remains a great deal more of this war, and the hard-won lessons buried inside it, that rewards a closer and a more honest look.